Well, no individual has done more to expose the nefarious underbelly of the so-called Antifa movement than Andy Ngo. Andy, who is an editor-at-large of the post-millennial website, has been beaten and harassed over his work. Now he's facing a new threat: cancellation by big tech. Andy Ngo is the author of the New York Times bestseller Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Andy joins me now. Andy, how has big tech come after you?
Well, I think Australians understand better than any other nation what happens when big tech goes out of control. I mean, your country was essentially held hostage for a time by Facebook. So what happened to me last weekend is that I received an email that said from SoundCloud, which hosted my podcast episodes, that I had violated its community guidelines. And this can include anything from hate speech to criminal activities to incitement to violence and even terrorism. And it said that I am permanently banned, that the decision is permanent, and that there's no way to appeal or to get more information. After the press covered this, within 48 hours, I got another email from SoundCloud that they had reversed the decision because there was a mistake that was made. I still don't know how the decision process works, but I suspect that if there was not the media kicked up by Fox News and other conservative media in the United States, that I would not have had this opportunity.
So this is the issue, isn't it? It's the natural justice to look at a decision, to contest the argument put forward by big tech, to take you off these platforms. It is a huge deal in society today. It silences your voice. What are they so scared of?
I don't know. I'm puzzled by that too. They didn't give me a reason the first time or the second time for why what they found was so offensive. I mean, my podcast interview included people like Jordan Peterson and other people that is hated by the left, but nothing that is egregious and no incitement to violence. But I think the big takeaway from this is that if you are just an average person who's been deplatformed and potentially lose a source of income, and if you don't have the media on your side to report on it, then you're forced to suffer in silence.
I want to move to the situation in Canada. It's a huge coverage here in Australia, I'm sure right around the world. Protesters have defaced and destroyed statues, set Catholic churches alight following the discovery of more than 1,000 unmarked graves at former schools for Indigenous children. Statues of the Queen, Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth and Captain James Cook were all those toppled. Justin Trudeau, Andy, has come out and apologised for the schools, all of which were run for more than a century. He hasn't had much to say, though, about the violent scenes. These are quite similar to protests we've seen right across the United States last year in particular. Why are they governments so reluctant to deal with the protesters like Antifa?
Well, to our neighbours in the north, they've been looking for their George Floyd moment, and because they haven't found that, and they don't have the same history of slavery as the United States, they've really latched on to Canada's original sin of the residential schools, and they are exploiting these very tragic discoveries of these unmarked graves at the former sites of these historical schools. And it's a free-for-all, essentially, by the far left and so-called Indigenous activists. They're burning churches to the ground. And I think that this really should be an international scandal, because if this was done in the context of warfare, these would be war crimes. Just over the weekend, a Vietnamese church in Calgary was also burned. There's been around a dozen now. And so the violence is really indiscriminate. It's going after churches of all denominations. It's going after statues of figures who had absolutely nothing to do with the residential schools, such as the Queen. And so... And the fact that the response from the Canadian government has been so milquetoast, it's not surprising. The left in Canada, as it does in the US, dominates government as well as media. So they are deathly afraid of pushing back on these far left extremists who are carrying out these acts of violence. against houses of worship and public property in the name of racial justice.
Look, I've got a lot of friends in Canada. I go to Canada quite frequently. I noticed that there was a lot of shame loaded into the concept of Canada Day this year. We've had the same shame loaded into Australia Day for many years, but that was part of the tone of these Antifa protests, not just outcry against faith-based organisations, but really targeting patriotism in Canada.
Yes, and we just had the 4th of July in the United States, and it was the same. And so, I mean, there's been a concerted effort going back many years now by the left to turn patriotism into to be a far-right trope or something like that. And unfortunately, I think that narrative has had a certain amount of success. In the United States, people associate American flag waving and other patriotic activities as a right-wing or indicative of support for Donald Trump. It's really divisive, and I think the heart of it is to really strike at the legitimacy of my country, of Canada, of your country, in the name of so-called decolonisation theory, which purports that these countries are not legitimate because they were conquered from other populations who were there previously.
I tell you what, we have a fight on our hands. Thank goodness for you, Andy. You've unmasked Antifa. I'm sure there's more to go, and you've got many friends here in Australia. We're glad to see you back on SoundCloud. Thanks for your time tonight.